Thanks everyone for joining us this morning. We're very happy that Dr. Steve Quarles has made the time to present to us this morning. I think it's going to be a pretty interesting webinar. Dr. Quarles, we certainly consider him to be one of the top wildland urban interface fire and structure vulnerability experts in North America. Before we get started, I just wanted to quickly mention the upcoming CAT IQ C4 conference. And if you check the chat box, which you should be able to access if you move your cursor up to the top left of your screen and click the chat function. There's some information on that conference, which is coming up in late January, early February. It's going to be in Gatineau. Very appropriate place, of course, for this type of event. There's some information on the event and also the link where you can register. And registrations are now open. So if that is of interest, please check out the site. And before we get started, this is our October webinar, and we should have another one coming up in November, and we'll be sending out some information on that in the next couple of weeks. So as I mentioned, this is a webinar going to be provided to us by Dr. Steve Quarles from IBHS. Dr. Quarles has been with IBHS since 2011. Before he joined IBHS, he was with the University of California as a cooperative extension advisor working on durability and in-service performance issues for wood frame buildings exposed to wildfires. And he was also involved with the California Office of the State Fire Marshal, involved in the development of an education program, and was an instructor related to the implementation of Chapter 7A of the California Building Code, which is the part of the code in California that relates to wildland urban interface fire protection for buildings, and is one of the few examples of senior level of government implementing code requirements for buildings to protect them against woody fire. So he has a significant experience in this area and has many interesting experiments underway at IBHS that we'll look forward to hearing about. And with that, I'll pass it to Dr. Quarles.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks everybody for joining. I guess I'll just get started. I'm going to be talking today, as Dan indicated, about wildfires and buildings. I'll be reviewing exposures, wildland fire exposures to buildings, and some of the vulnerabilities of buildings and mitigation strategies that we have found out, and others on ways to help buildings be better able to survive wildfire. And up until recently, our lab being one example, and other researchers, for example, NIST, information for the built environment has been a little bit lacking. There's been a lot of information about defensible space and vegetation, not as much about the building. I think that's changing with an increased research effort in this area. So I'd like to just spend a second talking about IBHS. For those of you that don't know, it is a member-based organization funded by the insurance industry. And our objective is just to conduct, as you see, scientific research to identify vulnerabilities and evaluate mitigation strategies for these vulnerabilities. We focus on natural hazards that have a wind component, so wind-driven rain, hail, and wildfire because of the Ember exposure. Once we find things that work, we try to get them implemented in codes and standards, and we also have a pretty active communication area to get this information to homeowners and others that can benefit from the things that we find out. So most of our research is conducted, wildfire research is conducted in this at the IBHS Research Center in Richburg, South Carolina. It's about an hour south of Charlotte, North Carolina. As you can see, it's a large chamber. It's a wind tunnel facility. We can put full-size buildings in and subject it to wind-related events. We have some small lab capabilities for many of the hazards that we investigate. wildfire, mostly we use this chamber. This is the inside of the chamber. In the left-hand picture, you can see the array of fans. There are 105 fans that can blow winds of up to 130 miles per hour, so roughly 58 meters per second. Each fan is roughly 1.5 meters in diameter. And you can see maybe in the foreground at the outlet some vertical ducts extending upward out of what looks to be a trench, which is what it is. This is our first endeavor at generating embers, and so the generator is below grade, and then the embers flow up through the generator through these vertical ducts into the wind stream of the wind tunnel. So that's what those vertical steel ducts are. The right-hand side picture, you can see a building on a turntable. So this turntable allows us to turn the building to evaluate the impact of or effect of wind direction on whatever we happen to be investigating. It's an interesting capability or useful capability just because of what wind does around the building. So we can, as I said, put full-size buildings, residential, some small commercial, and 1 or 2 stories. So that's sort of a nutshell our facility. I wanted to move on and talk about wildfire exposures. Research, post-fire investigations have indicated and shown that ember ignitions are the major cause of building ignitions during wildland fires. It isn't the wildland fire flame front that actually results in ignition of buildings. It is ember-related things, and it's what embers can do directly and indirectly, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. The left-hand picture is a good example of the importance of the ember or embers. You see a burning building. This is from the Angora fire, Lake Tahoe area in 2007, California. You see a lot of green vegetation around this burning building. So the fire didn't burn to the building. Embers blew over the green vegetation, ignited some vulnerable part of the building, in this case a home, and ultimately resulted in the complete loss of the home. The right-hand picture is the second generation Ember generators working. This was during a vent study evaluating the effectiveness of vents or the vulnerability of vents to Ember entry. And so I think it's impressive display, I think, of how these generators work. The burner part of the generator would be underneath those vertical ducts, and they're in a 6 foot or so deep trench. So that's just an example of how we conduct some experiments. So this direct versus indirect. So direct ignition is when embers directly ignite a combustible material. So on the left-hand picture, embers accumulating at the base of this combustible wood shingle wall ignited just from the ember accumulation and ignition sort of directly. Indirect examples are on the right-hand picture. Debris and gutter, embers ignite debris and gutter, and then that flame from the burning debris impinges on the edge of the roof. Similarly, on the ground where we have bark mulch, embers ignite bark mulch, and you have a flaming exposure to the side of the building. Whether it be the siding itself, can be the windows, as you see there's a window in this picture. So that's an example of indirect. And here's another example of indirect. This is rock mulch at the base of this particular wall. This is the Waldo Canyon fire, 2012 in Colorado Springs. This rock mulch is a good detail, we think, but the homeowner had put a wood pile on top of the rock mulch. So embers ignited wood pile, flaming exposure to siding, and you can see then on the left-hand picture the kicked away wood pile likely by firefighters that showed up. And then the inside of the garage showing, just in this case, damage. So this house was only damaged. Had no one shown up, it would have likely been a different story. So the other two exposures, radiant heat and flame contact, you'll notice that indirect often results in radiant heat and or direct flame impingement exposure. So the radiant heat, this is from a fire in eastern Tennessee, not the recent Gatlinburg fire, but the one before in the same county. So extended radiant heat from one burning building to another ignites without direct flame contact. There was a window in the left-hand picture, the upper part, you see sort of flames coming out. There was a window there. It's possible that the glass was broken in the window, but it was a big overhang, so could have been ignition from heat trapping up in that area of the wood components of this particular building. The right-hand picture is just several minutes later, the same building that's just starting. In the left-hand picture, it became involved and burned to the ground relatively quickly. So it took 15 or so minutes to go from the left-hand picture to what you see in the right-hand picture. And then direct flame contact, in this case, it was fire burning up. This draw reached the home that you see burning. So it was a direct flame contact from actually this particular fire, burning up the draw and impinging on at the bottom of the wall of this home, and then burned up and involved the decks as you see here. So the three major, the three exposures: Ember, radiant, and direct flame contact. Indirect Ember results in radiant and or direct flame contact. So those are the typical, the Ember would be a typical exposure from wildland fire and then you have these other mechanisms that result in ignition of home from the Ember. When fires move into a community with closer home-to-home spacing, then often it just turns into an urban kind of fire where you have a lot of home-to-home. And that's what you were seeing here in this left-hand picture. This is from the Coffee Park area of the recent fire in Northern California. And the right-hand picture is a similar fire from the same area. You know, it's likely that at this house there was a fire truck was there suppressing the fire spread from the destroyed house on the right to the damaged house on the left. So the damaged house on the left, some bubbling paint, a broken outer pane of a dual pane window was the things, and then some sagging of the vinyl frame of the window. So that's what we see in this picture. So ultimately, when we have a lot of home losses in a wildfire, it's you get to a point where you have a number of home-to-home fire spread scenarios. So we always like to talk about what needs to be done to protect a home in wildland area, wildfire-prone areas, and we always talk about the need for a coupled approach where materials and design features are incorporated into a building, and also defensible space in terms of vegetation management and location of combustible materials on the property are addressed. So the left-hand picture shows a home with could be better defensible space, and then the right-hand picture shows a window with tempered glass. So that's getting at the material part, and the left-hand picture is getting at the defensible space part. And the idea here is that no matter what the homeowner may do on the property, that home still has to resist an Ember exposure, because the homeowner or business owner really doesn't have enough control over enough space to bring the Ember exposure to a given building to zero. So that home always has to be able to resist an Ember exposure. But with good defensible space, then they can minimize opportunity for direct flame contact or extended radiant heat exposure to the house because of the selection, maintenance, location of vegetation and other combustible materials like a wood pile or a tool shed. So it's a coupled approach, and we think that's the best way to minimize the opportunity for a home to ignite during a wildfire. As an organization, we are really interested in both new construction and existing construction. So most of us already live someplace. So the things that we find out really need to be applicable to existing, to the existing buildings. And building codes typically only address new construction. So we need a way to encourage homeowners to make changes to their house to make those existing buildings more resistant to wildfire. So we try to provide information on both ends. So we're going to walk through the vulnerability of buildings by talking about it by components. So roof, siding, fence, deck, vents. These are sort of the main components. And so we're going to walk through now, but before we do that, I'm just going to spend just a second on defensible space, in particular, this zone 1. I think defensible space is sometimes called other things, but it really just applies to how you, where you place vegetation, how you maintain it, the kind of vegetation that you choose, and then where you locate other combustible things. In Canada, this is, you refer to it as priority zones. I think that's what the Fire Smart program does anyway. In the United States, defensible space is a common term. Other terms are used. Typically, you have just 2 zones from the house out 30 feet or roughly 9 or 10 meters. And then from that point, so 9 or 10 meters out to roughly 30 meters out. What we have done and other education organizations have done is incorporate a separate zone that is really close to the building within a meter or 2 of the house. And we call that the non-combustible or low combustible zone. And that's a really important part because it minimizes the opportunity for embers to ignite things close to the house. That would definitely result in radiant heat exposure or direct flame contact to the building. So with this non-combustible zone, it's one really critical part of this ember resistant ignition component for a building. So these are examples of non-combustible zones. This is again from Colorado Springs, the left 2 pictures. We like to extend this non-combustible zone to include the entire footprint of the deck, so under the deck, and that's what that middle picture is showing. The same kind of zone that would be within a meter or 2 of the house, you extend it to include the entire footprint of the deck. What we want to avoid under a deck is the storage of a lot of combustible materials. It's kind of hard for any deck to resist a burning, your own private lumber yard under your deck. It's difficult for any deck to resist that kind of exposure. Okay, so we're going to talk about roof and the other components now. So I like to separate the roof into what I call the field of the roof, and that's that red circle there you see, and then some edge issues, which are the yellow squares. The fire rating of a roof is really addressed by the red circle part, the field of the roof, and code doesn't necessarily think about or consider these edge of roof issues that can, during wildfires, can make the roof quite vulnerable. So we're going to talk about those. So that the fire rating for the roof, this field of the roof thing, it's a several part test method, and this picture is showing one part. This is the part that gives a Class A roof its name. So on the left-hand picture, you see a burning brand, a burning crib. It's a wooden structure that is ignited and placed on the roof covering. This roof section is, if you would to go on your roof and cut a 3-foot by 4-foot section out of your roof and take it to the lab. This is sort of what you're looking for. So you're really looking to see whether the fire on the roof penetrates through the roof into what would be your attic space. So the right-hand picture shows flames coming into what would be your attic space from the fire that you see on the left-hand picture. So as built, this roof material assembly is not a Class A, not the highest rating. There are other components to the fire rating that include flame spread and flame contact kind of exposures, and whether or not the burning roof covering generates embers or firebrands. And you have to pass all of them to become a Class A, for example. This is just showing the burn through or fire resistance part. This burning brand, it's a three-layer construction, kind of sandwich where small pieces of squares of wood are nailed together, and Class A one is 12 inches by 12 inches. So anyway, so that's the field of the roof issue. But the edge of roof issues can be vulnerable to embers more so than the field of the roof. So that's why we need to really address these when we're talking about wildfire resistant strategies for homes and buildings. So we see here a tile kind of roof. The the left-hand picture is a flat tile, but at the hips, you notice that there are openings during the day-to-day life of the home. Debris can blow into this gap and accumulate underneath this non-combustible roof covering. During wildfires, embers can follow right into the same location, ignite those fine fuels, the fine pine needles or leaf litter that gets blown in there, and ignite the home that way. So embers ignite leaf litter or fine fuels, which then flaming exposure to the roofing felt, then to the other structural components of the home. The right-hand picture shows a barrel tile roof. Similarly, you can see in the open ends on sort of the right-hand part of that picture, birds can crawl up in there and build nests. Rodents can do the same. Debris can do the same. During wildfires, embers follow. So you ignite fine fuels, and then those fine fuels then ignite the other more structural components. So in all of these, the strategy is to block them, and block these openings. So you see on the left-hand part of the right-hand picture, this is a homeowner done thing where he just used dyed mortar mix to plug that opening. You can buy some commercial options, commercially available stops. These are often called bird stops on the eave. Or you can, this is a homemade job that he just hadn't finished it yet when I took the picture. So these are really effective strategies, and both ones that we recommend. Chapter 7A in California does acknowledge this particular vulnerability, and so you have to bird stop that or provide an alternate way to protect the roof deck. But the same kind of vulnerability occurs at the hip, as you see on the left-hand picture here. These are critical things that need to be addressed to improve the resistance of a home to wildfire. Here's another example. This is what I lump into this complex roof issues, and the two pictures show a similar thing, and that is roof to wall conditions. So the left-hand side is a split level house. The right-hand side just shows a dormer with siding. So you know, these are both Class A roof coverings. These are asphalt comp roof coverings, which are Class A. And you see in each one there was debris on the roof. This debris will be readily ignited by an ember exposure, and the Class A roof covering can handle this kind of exposure. In this case, it would damage the roof, but it wouldn't burn through into the occupied space. But the vulnerability for this roof is the siding. Can the siding provide the same kind of protection? So the left-hand picture, it's a shingle, a cedar shingle siding product. I would argue likely not. And so the vulnerability of the picture of the home on the left isn't the roof per se, but it's the siding that could look like a roof vulnerability. So we need to make sure that the siding protects in these situations, that the siding provides comparable protection to the roof as a Class A roof does. So in this case, replacing the siding locally in this area, being really vigilant about removing debris from roof are options. The most, surefire one is to replace siding locally in this area. So gutters, we saw this left-hand picture a little bit earlier. This is debris in gutter ignited by embers. The two things we're seeing in the left-hand picture, the left-hand part of that picture shows a vinyl gutter. So that vinyl gutter will detach if the debris is ignited by embers and fall to the ground, and it will become a what's on the ground problem. The gutter on the right is a metal gutter. It'll stay put. And so it's an edge of the roof issue, but we need to make sure that that edge of roof can handle that exposure. So removing debris from the gutter, in a routine way is one way to minimize that occurrence. And then another way is to provide to help with this is to provide a metal drip edge at that roof edge. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. You also see this, again, this burning debris on the ground, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about windows. So one option is a gutter cover device, and that tends to minimize the accumulation of debris in the gutter itself, and we see an example of this in the right-hand picture. But you'll notice, depending on the gutter cover device, that sometimes it just forces the accumulation of material someplace else. In this case, it's on top of the gutter cover. You'll also notice if you walk around and look that it can also force the accumulation of debris on the roof covering. So these are not maintenance-free options. That still will require some maintenance. We recommend a non-combustible gutter cover device, just because debris accumulation on top of a plastic gutter, the gutter cover device might just result in ignition of that device from an ember exposure should a lot of debris accumulate on top of it. So here's just a continuation of the gutter story. Let's go to the right-hand picture first. This is an integrated gutter with a drip edge, so the gutter slips in underneath the roof covering, and then there's a vertical leg down which bends around and becomes the gutter. If your gutter doesn't have this, you can buy pretty easily and inexpensively angle flashing that you would just slip under the roof and let that vertical leg hang down and go over top of the vertical leg of the gutter where it attaches to the fascia board. This provides just protection of the wood components, the roof sheathing and the typically wooden fascia board. So it protects that should debris ignite. And alternate benefit, or additional benefit, is that it can reduce the ember entry and accumulation at that joint. So the left-hand picture is from an early experiment that we did, and you can see the red circle is circling a glowing ember that is entering at the gap between the roof sheathing and the fascia board. So with that angle flashing in front of it, that ember doesn't have a way to come in. And so this is particularly beneficial if you have a soffitted eave where you have a horizontal return from the roof edge back to the wall. But it also is good no matter what kind of construction you have, because it stops the ability of the ember to accumulate at that gap between the roof sheathing and fascia, which can result in ignition at that joint and then spread that way up the roof. Skylights is, they used to be pretty common in California, at least. They're becoming less common because of energy code regulations. And there's a couple of kinds of materials commonly used for skylights where they do occur. The flat roofs, the flat skylights that you see in the left-hand picture typically are tempered glass or laminated glass, and often 2 layers to provide additional protection to the occupant. Or the one on the right is a plastic dome type. Most guidance tells you to avoid the plastic dome type. I think we need to incorporate some additional information regarding what the slope of the roof is. So these 2 pictures depict relatively flat roofs or low slope roofs, and you'll notice that debris doesn't really accumulate on the domed skylight at all. Well, there's a little bit, but not nearly as much as a flat one. And so the flat skylight with a lot of accumulation of debris, that would be a flame impingement to that, to the glass there, and whether or not that can resist, whether or not the glass can resist is really a function of the type of glass. So again, removing debris from roof is a good idea, but for flat roofs, since they all have metal components surrounding as flashing for the skylight to roof intersection, I think you can argue that domed is better for flat roofs. But once the steeper the roof, then the more it acts like a wall, and then you really need to be considering what that wall is seeing in terms of vegetation outboard, and you really want to minimize the opportunity for extended radiant heat to be for that wall to see that extended radiant heat. So you want to make quite sure that your vegetation management is good on areas where you have a steeper roof. So let's see. So let's talk a little bit about vents now. There's a number of vents that can be on your home if you have an attic space, for example, that's vented. So typically you're going to have one set of vents in the under-eave area. These are nominally inlet vents, and then you're going to have other vents on the roof or at the gable end that would be nominally outlet vents. And if you're built on a crawl space, you'll also have foundation or crawl space vents. But we also have other vents on the vertical wall that would be for rooms where you might have combustion air equipment like a hot water heater or a furnace. You need to have makeup air, and so those are typically screened openings. These are all places where embers can enter. There's been a number of post-fire reports where ember entry through vents ignited combustible materials on the inside of the house, and the house burned from the inside out just from these this kind of exposure. So we recently completed an experiment that evaluated the vulnerability of vents to ember entry. I'll be talking about some of that today. That report is available online, and I'll show you the website address in a bit. So under-eave, there's a couple of different basic designs. There's on the left, there's what I call softened eave, and that's where there's a horizontal member that extends from the roof edge back to the exterior wall. The left-hand picture, that's a horizontal member. It's a pretty wide overhang, really good for wind and rain kind of situation. But there's that strip vent that is circled in red. And then on the right-hand side, there's what I call open eave construction, and that's where if you look up into the under-eave area, you can see roof rafters. That's open eave construction. The venting for the attic spaces and the blocking between these joists, between these roof rafters. So our experiment clearly showed that, I should show you a picture here. So the right-hand picture shows ember entry into an open eave kind of construction. So there's blocking, vents and blocking. Embers readily entered that kind of construction. And similarly, we see on the left-hand picture a gable end vent where embers readily entered that area too. So what we found, sort of in a nutshell, is that vents that present a face that's perpendicular to the wind flow, embers enter really easily. If that vent is parallel to the wind flow, such as the softened eave on the left picture here, embers are far less likely to enter. We did wind-driven rain study recently and looked at the location of that event. And so close to the house is actually that we see here, close to the building is really a bad location for a strip vent. It should be located close to the roof edge to minimize ember entry into the area over the occupied space. Okay, so we've talked about this, so I'll keep on moving. So gable end, I should say that even though the open eave vent on your right is nominally an inlet vent and the gable end vent on your left is nominally an exit air vent, when wind is blowing against the vent, that can happen during wildland fire events. Every vent that the wind blows against is an inlet vent. The embers will want to enter that vent. And on the leeward side of the house, that vent, no matter what it nominally is, it's an outlet vent. So in this case, wind blowing against gable end vent, it is an inlet vent. The embers enter readily. So one of the ways to minimize the number and size, in particular size of embers, is to make sure you have finer mesh screen. Some studies that I was involved with earlier have clearly shown that embers entering through 6mm mesh vents, or what we would call 1/4-inch mesh vents, can readily ignite fine fuels. Less likely the finer the mesh, so 3mm, the 1/8 inch. The size of the ember that can enter is lower. The embers will land on that screen on the outside, and they'll just burn down until they can fit through the available area, and then they'll come in to the occupied or the enclosed space. We've decided on this 3mm vent as mesh as a good size. You can use even 1/16 of an inch mesh, so roughly a millimeter and a half. We just have found that really plugs up pretty readily with debris, and so it minimizes the opportunity for the vent to do its moisture management function when you do that. So the 3mm seems to be a compromise in terms of limiting the size and to some extent the number of embers that enter, more so than the 6mm vent. So 6mm vent we don't recommend. 3mm we think is good. 1.5 is better. It just, as a homeowner, you need to be ready to do a little bit more maintenance to make sure that the debris is removed from the vent on a regular basis. In California, because of the way that the building code is written, there's language that says that vents need to resist the entry of embers and flame, and that has resulted in the development of a standard test method to evaluate the resistance to entry of embers and flames, and it also has resulted in a number of vents that are commercially available. And so these are the vents. In this picture, I'll just describe a little bit. The ember part is, the ember part and the flame part can be different features of the vent. Sometimes they're the same, but the flame screens don't really minimize flame entry particularly. The finer the mesh will do that somewhat, but for 1/4-inch mesh, flames just pass right through. The upper left-hand picture uses screening, and that white coating it's a intermittent coating on a honeycomb mesh that's largely for flame impingement resistance. But this vent does have thickness, and unless the unless the ember is coming at it straight on, it might hit the sidewalls, but it does tend to minimize ember entry also. The lower left uses a steel wool kind of design to capture embers on their way in so they can't get through. The middle vent uses a baffle design, and then the far right vent also uses kind of a steel wool mesh to minimize entry. So these are available in California and not as readily available elsewhere. They're more expensive than screening, than just mesh. but the mesh, as I said, won't do anything for flame impingement, and these do have to meet a flame impingement component of this test method. We looked at ridge vents. This is a ridge vent, and this is one that is rated to resist the entry of wind-driven rain. And we've found that it was also quite good at resisting the entry of embers. So the functional part of this is that external baffle you see on the left-hand picture. We cut that external baffle off just as an experimental design thing, and that's what you see on the right-hand picture. And definitely ember entry was far more easy when that external baffle was removed. In this case, there was actually a wind dependency, so higher wind speeds and embers could just traverse over from one side of the ridge vent to the other and go out. Lower wind speeds, the ember would lose energy and just drop right into the attic space below the ridge vent. So definitely, the external baffle is a good feature. The problem, as you might have figured, is that typically ridge vents are plastic, and so you really need to avoid what you see in this picture, and that is the accumulation of debris against the ridge vent. Embers will ignite that debris, providing a flaming exposure to that plastic ridge vent, which could be the vulnerability of this particular home. There are other, as I said, other kind of vents. This is a dryer vent, but just has mesh. We recommend more of a right-hand side exhaust vent, so that when the air is blowing against it, the flapper stays closed, and the exhaust air from the dryer, when it's operating, will allow the hot air to exit. There's a louver kind of a vent for this application that does a similar thing. Let's talk a little bit about exterior walls now. Siding is vulnerable if it ignites by two mechanisms. One, if you have vertical flame spread up the wall that you see on the left-hand side, and then the other vulnerability would be if it burns through at a lap joint into the stud cavity and then into the house that way. Both of these can be vulnerable, even if the flame penetration doesn't occur. On the left-hand picture, vertical flame spread up the wall will impinge on other things on the way. So window, under-eave areas. So really avoiding ignition of the siding is really the best way to go. If you have combustible siding, then that makes the non-combustible zone in front of that siding really important. And this vertical non-combustible zone, so to speak, from the ground to the start of the siding is also equally important. So that accumulation of embers at that wall to ground interface is against non-combustible things. So here we just see the same story. So ignition of siding at that left-hand picture, the red circle, ignited siding with no clearance. The right-hand picture is 6 inches of non-combustible material. Nothing happened there. Nothing actually happened even with 2 inches. But 6 inches seems to be a good conservative number for minimizing the opportunity for ember ignition to occur via accumulation at the base of the wall. So in addition to this horizontal non-combustible zone, this 0 to 1.5 meters, say, we like also to see, as in the right-hand picture, another zone that is a vertical zone where you also have a non-combustible material, so that, as I said, ember accumulation is non-combustible against non-combustible. Makes ember accumulation be for naught in terms of igniting things. This is just to follow on some more additional information. So here we have on the left-hand picture, non-combustible siding, but bark mulch going all the way up to it. So embers, as we have seen, will readily ignite that bark mulch and will burn to the home in this case, either because wind is blowing that way or the backing fire, it'll get to the home. So you may think that you have non-combustible siding, you'll be okay, but the right-hand picture really shows that you have to consider, in this case, the assembly of the wall. So the wood-based sheathing product hangs out over that stem wall, and so flames would, in this particular situation, impinge on this combustible material. So regardless, even though you have non-combustible siding, you still have combustible materials in the assembly that would be vulnerable to this kind of situation. So even though you may have non-combustible siding, this non-combustible zone, both horizontally and vertically, is really important from an ember ignition resistance perspective. So there's been some interest in coatings. We did a small study to evaluate the performance of fire retardant type coatings. These are typically intumescent types that develop an insulating layer when they get hot. It was a weathering study that we did in collaboration with University of North Carolina at Charlotte. They had the cone calorimeter you see on the right. It's the radiant heater. And we evaluated the coated samples that you see in the weathering fence on your left. And you can see the outlet of our wind tunnel sort of in the background. What we found was that coatings in exterior, these kind of coatings in exterior applications don't really weather well. So there are a number of other things you can do besides apply a coating, and we're suggesting that those be done. So principally these non-combustible zones that we just talked about. Once formulations of paints have improved so that they would weather better, then this might be an option, and arguably it is an inexpensive option compared to replacing siding everywhere, for example. So this would be particularly useful if the home-to-home spacing in your neighborhood is small. Then replacing siding or a coating would be an effective way, but as long as they're not weathering well, then we don't think that this is a viable option at this point. Another kind of coating that is sometimes suggested would be a gel coating. This is something that would be applied just prior to evacuating, for example. So we have done some evaluation of this, and we're doing a little bit more this year, again, with the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. I think you just need to be really careful about how it's applied, or else it may not work well for you. And this just shows the vulnerability of that coating by missing that little part of the under part of the drip edge that is shown in the left-hand picture in the red circle, resulted in failure of the wall, so burned through into the stud cavity. So definitely the gel-coated wall worked better than the uncoated wall that you see on the right in the right-hand picture, but regardless, you still had failure at the base of the wall. Fire would have burned into the stud cavity. The result would have been similar. I think this is a particular problem with homeowner use, because likely this will be the very first time they've used the product. It is used by firefighters and more professional firefighters. They're more skilled at application. So I think the effectiveness would really depend on that also. We talk about windows. Windows are vulnerable if the glass breaks, and then flames and/or embers can enter, or if the frame ignites and burns through. So the left-hand picture is a picture of glass breakage. The right-hand picture is frame failure. Research that we did here that was done at the University of California, and also in NIST has done some window research, as has been done in Australia. The results indicate that glass is the most vulnerable part of the window. So dual pane tempered glass is a good way to go for wildfire-prone areas, and you can be somewhat indifferent to frame type. If you have vinyl windows and you have single or double hung window, you want to make sure that that middle part that you see in the right-hand picture has a metal reinforcement member that would make it less likely to deform and have the window fall out. So that's the only exception to indifference to frame. Also, the operable part should be screened. The left-hand picture shown here basically shows embers accumulating on the screen. This is a combustible screen, but it did a good job of keeping embers out of the occupied space until flames touched it. Once flames touched it, then the right-hand picture shows the screen failed, flames entered, embers entered, it ceased to do its job in all fronts. So screens can be really effective in reducing radiant heat exposure to the glass. They do a good job of keeping embers out. We always recommend closing windows when wildfire threatens, just for the ember entry performance. But screens are useful for situations where you may not be home to close the window, for example. You just want to make sure that flames can't touch them, and this is another reason for this non-combustible zone right next to the house. We're getting close to the end of sort of prepared talks. I want to talk a little bit about decks and fences, but decks first. This is an attached deck, ember exposure to the top, or flames burning up underneath are two ways that decks are vulnerable. If ignited, the deck can then break glass on some access doors. So in this case, break the glass in that sliding door. Can ignite combustible siding. This is a T111 siding product. So it's a wood-based siding product. I think if all decks did was burn and fall off the building, we'd be less concerned. But since they are attached to the building and can provide a pathway of fire to the building, home or building, we're interested in the performance of decking. So this reason that's one reason for this careful management of vegetation, so that flames cannot get to the under part of the deck. And really the question then is how well do deck boards resist the exposure of embers? Because no matter what you have done in terms of defensible space, your deck will see an ember exposure when wildfire threatens the house or the area. The right-hand picture is just an under-deck fire. This was just a demonstration I did a number of years ago, but you see the under-deck ignition of deck and then ignition of combustible siding. It was a pretty dramatic fire on this little teeny display sample here. So there are ways actually that decks attached to the house that can make that part be vulnerable also. And so we're looking at this particular deck to wall attachment. You have a gap between the deck board that is next to the house and the house itself. Debris accumulates there. Embers will ignite that debris, and you have a flaming exposure, in this case, to this shingle-sided house. So removing debris from that area is really important. We can use a metal flashing detail to have ember accumulation be against a metal object as opposed to the wood siding. Just you have to be careful if that approach is taken, because you don't really want water to get behind that metal flashing, because you don't have decay or rot occurring in that wood siding product. So that the deck to wall attachment is something that we need to look at and then mitigate where necessary. Now this is pictures from a study that we did investigating the ember ignition potential of decks. So you'll notice on the left-hand picture there's a rather large deck, but the test deck part is just a small bit that is next to that wall coming out from the building. You can sort of see, I think, the deck part. We did this because embers will naturally flow away from the building just because of what the airflow does. So the embers will try to accumulate at the base of the wall, at the deck of the wall, but then they'll flow out unless something stops them. And they'll naturally stop sort of where this deck is placed. And that's why we placed it there. So you'll notice that in the right-hand picture that we do have flaming ignition occurring. Flaming ignition, where it occurred, consistently occurred at the gap between deck boards where the support joists were located. So the embers landed in that gap and either passed all the way through because there wasn't a joist there, or landed on top of the joist, and that would be the ignition location. So for our experiment, we incorporated wood siding products, fire retardant wood siding products, and some wood plastic composite products. And these products complied with a California test or didn't comply. We picked ones that went both ways. The California test is a flame impingement exposure to the underside of the deck. So we were just interested in knowing whether if the deck had complied in California, did it provide sufficient information regarding the ignition potential from an ember exposure. So that report will be available pretty soon. We're just finishing up one little bit, and then it will be put on our website. So if you're interested in that aspect, it'll be there, I'm thinking, within a few weeks or earlier. So we basically saw that only lower density woods were really vulnerable to ember ignition right away. The higher density hardwoods performed similar to wood plastic composites. So it seems like higher density materials resisted ignition more so than the lower density woods. And the fire retardant treated wood also was not vulnerable to an ember exposure. Our ember exposure was up to an hour, so we feel that was a pretty severe exposure that where we were monitoring for ignition. The lower density softwood ignited within 12 to 15 minutes, and then the one case where we had ignition, that little asterisk, one of the two samples ignited. In terms of no, so it was sort of no one time and yes another time. And that took close to 50 minutes of steady ember exposure before ignition occurred. So this other thing that we observed that was, I guess if you thought about it, maybe not so surprising, but it was surprising when you were underneath the deck and had embers falling on you. If they didn't stop at the joist, it just came right on through and landed on the ground. And so we put some debris on the ground underneath the deck, and sure enough, we were able to ignite that debris. This sort of reinforces, I think, our guidance and in terms of wanting to have a non-combustible zone that extends under the entire footprint of the deck, because embers that land on that deck are going to fall straight through and land on whatever's underneath it. So better it be something non-combustible. So this is just a short segue or diversion, I guess, into what we're doing right now in the lab. Later on today, we'll be doing another experiment. But this also gets, it's a visual for what I was just trying to describe a couple of slides ago. So these are embers falling at the house. They hit the side of the house, go down to the base, and then outward away from the house. That's just what wind does, and embers makes it easy to see what the wind is doing. So you'll see the two red circles. One red circle is right at that house to floor, and you can see the little bright area. Those are embers accumulating at the base of the wall, so that needs to be protected. And then if you have a smooth surface, and a deck is a smooth enough surface unless you have a piece of furniture on it or whatnot, those embers will flow away from the deck until they get some distance away. That's a function of the height of the wall. And then they stop. So you get a dead zone there. And so that's where accumulation would naturally occur. And that's where we placed our deck, is where they would naturally occur or naturally stop and accumulate. So it's just, and so our next study that we're doing now is assuming the deck ignites, given that there's this reverse flow of air from the wall out, what does it take for the fire of an ignited deck that ignites outboard of the wall to burn to the wall? So if you fix what's going on at the roof, at the wall to ground intersection, then should it ignite outboard of that, what's the likelihood of the fire burning to the house? And our experiments these next few weeks are designed to address that particular question. Okay, the last topic is fence. Fences we worry about because if they ignite, they can serve as a wick and fire can burn to the house. So, you know, that's the left-hand picture showing the mechanism of fire spread to the house from a fence. And then the right-hand picture is just a lattice fence burning. So we did, in collaboration with United States NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology. We did this collaborative study in our lab where we wanted to understand the Ember ignition potential of common combustible fencing, and then the likelihood of flame spread to the buildings or to the test building or a house. So we see two things going on here. The left-hand picture shows what we call the privacy fence. That's a fence where the planks are all on one side of those horizontal support planks. And then the right-hand side shows what we call the good neighbor fence. So those planks alternate so that, you know, if I'm a good neighbor, I'll take care of my side of the fence, and you, my good neighbor, will take care of the other side of the fence in terms of maintenance and whatnot. So the other thing that we incorporate, as you see in the good neighbor fence side, is that we incorporated bark mulch at the base of some fencing, and that was to mimic all things combustible that could be underneath the fence. And these are, the bark mulch is sort of the worst case of all things combustible. Typically it would be dried grass, for example. And then the left-hand picture, so you can see that we did some experiments without that base of fence combustible material. So ignition occurred most likely from strictly an Ember ignition perspective on this privacy fence. So it provided the most consistent vertical to horizontal places where you could create platforms and have Ember accumulation. So you see embers accumulated and resulted in flaming ignition where the post and horizontal planks met. And the same thing would occur in any kind of fence, but because the good neighbor fence and the lattice fence that we also investigated were more porous, it was much more easy for air to flow through those fences. It took a much longer time for Ember ignitions to occur. And we definitely found that the most likely scenario for flame spread to occur to the building was when you had combustible things at the bottom of the fence. Often with the fence itself, again, the parts would just burn, the members would just burn apart. And once they got far enough apart, flaming would stop and the radiant heat couldn't happen because the distance between members was too great. So this was, again, evidence to be pretty vigilant about keeping debris from accumulating at the base of the fence that would minimize the opportunity for flame spread to occur in the fence and to get to your home. So here we see an example of this flame spread part of the study, and you'll notice that in this lattice fence example, it just couldn't get to the house because the fence detached from itself, and the lattice fence components are far enough apart that they just can't sustain flaming ignition. So NIST did a pretty interesting study where they put lattice on both sides of the fence, and that was a far different picture. So I don't really see in the field two-side lattice type fences unless maybe it's in a garden and you want to have a creeping like a pea, some sort of vegetation growth on it. But that design should not be used anywhere close to a house because the result is just different. So one-sided lattice is one kind of performance, but two-sided lattice is just a bad design. Our guidance has always been, though, don't put a combustible fence next to your house, and we are not changing that guidance. So having a non-combustible fencing component next to your house is the way to go. It seems like it's fairly conservative, but that's perfectly good. So we're not changing our guidance a whit. Keep debris away from your fence, and then use these non-combustible components where within 5 or so feet of the house. Sometimes fence sections are an 8-foot length, so that 8-foot length would be a good also dimension to be non-combustible where it attaches to a house or a building. Just want to summarize here. We talked a lot about exposures, Ember, direct flame contact, radiant heat, and then this difference between direct Ember ignition and indirect Ember ignition. Direct Ember ignition, Embers ignite a combustible thing by themselves. Indirect Embers ignite a combustible material, which then provides a flaming exposure or extended radiant heat exposure to the building. Talked about the coupled approach for building survival. These include vegetation management and location of combustibles on the property, typically lumped into this category called defensible space, and then the importance of materials and design features in minimizing Ember ignition of these components. If it's a wildland fire to home ignition scenario, there's a lot of things that you can do in terms of these small details to minimize Ember accumulation at the house or building or getting into the home, either into an attic space or other kind of area where a vent is in front of. These things I think work well. If it's more home-to-home spacing, once a home or two ignites, then home-to-home fire spread becomes much more common way of fire spread, and the flame contact kind of scenarios and extended radiant heat scenarios that would lead to ignition are more common. And some of the things that might work for wildland fire to home cease to work as well for home to home. So with that, I'd be happy to take questions. You can see our website there and my email address, and I encourage you to go to our website. There's, I think, a lot of good information there, reports as they are finished to get located there. If you have any particular questions, you can welcome to send me an email. So I really appreciate your attention, and we'll see if there's any questions.
Hi, Steve, it's Dan here. Thanks very much for comprehensive presentation. I'm sure lots of people on the line are thinking about their own houses as you're going through all the very specific vulnerabilities. And there's a question here related to whether or not this presentation will be posted. It will be posted within a few days. Early next week, we'll have a YouTube video on our site, so you can check it then. So we do have a few questions. If you would like to ask a question, just remember to use the Q&A box. So first question goes to Paul Kovacs. So you promote a coupled approach dealing with vegetation and construction. Concern about vegetation appears to be to have widespread support, but it's harder to secure support to address these construction issues that you discussed. For one example is California is one of the very few jurisdictions that incorporates these measures into the building code. So why is it so difficult to secure attention and action on the construction issue, especially compared to the vegetation issue?
I guess I'm not quite sure what the answer to that is. I mean, some of it might be cost. Replacing siding is expensive, but I think there are things you can do that are short of that would be really effective against Ember exposures. And some of the things you can do are really inexpensive. A drip edge is really inexpensive. I mean, that metal drip edge is an inexpensive thing to buy, and it doesn't take a lot of skill to insert it. I've done it myself, so I know that part is true. And then buying fine mesh screen is also pretty inexpensive. So I think, we really try to develop and distribute simple materials, educational materials, to try to encourage people to do these things. I think beyond that, it becomes more of a social science kind of a question, because I think people have different risk tolerances, and maybe if you live in a wildfire-prone area, you already have, we're pretty tolerant of that, so you're just not as worried. I'll be happy to have a discussion, but I don't think I have a simple answer to that question.
Right. Well, not a simple question to answer, as you're mentioning. Well, actually, a couple of questions about the California, this Chapter 7A of the California Code. So, many of the risk reduction measures that you mentioned are sort of material differences, like specifically using different siding materials and that sort of thing. But I would say most of them are, design issues. If you're talking about complex roofs and, simple issues related to decks and fencing and that sort of thing. So, given that California has implemented a number of these requirements, and this may be a difficult question to answer because homes are all different, but is there a sort of a sense of the relative increase in cost that's required to implement Chapter 7A for, typical homes in California, for an individual home?
Right. So, yeah, thanks for that question. When California was considering adopting Chapter 7A, they actually paid a company to come up with a cost difference for building to 7A requirements. And that study, and I can find that study, so if you're interested in it, I can send it to whoever asked the question. It was a relatively small amount. It was 3 to 5% increase. I think, but I think that was a new construction kind of approach, and that's what 7A is about, except for some jurisdictions where they have a significant remodel component to it. So if you do a big remodel, then that remodel will have to comply. But typically it's a new construction, and so it's easier. And at least the way the 7A is right now, 7A requires tempered glass and windows. That's one big difference between a non-7A house and a 7A house. But non-combustible siding is becoming pretty common, and Class A roofs are very common. And even the asphalt comp roof is a Class A roof. It's pretty common. So the actual cost is not so much as that study indicated. I think that the big nut is existing homes. I'm working on a project now with Headwaters Economics out of Montana to come up with cost differences for components that increase or improve the wildfire resistance of homes. And one thing that we're focusing on is the cost of retrofitting. So, adding this or that. And one thing that I'm particularly interested in is going from an open eave construction to a softened eave because of what that does to venting. So there's a number of things we're looking at, and that report, I think, what we do is due out in 2018 sometime, so not too far away.
Okay, great. Yeah, if you were able to send those reports, you can send them to me, and I can send them on to whoever might be interested. Another question about home vulnerability, again from Paul Kovacs. When you assess the vulnerability of a home, are there a few key features, 3 or 4 features that typically account for most of the risk?
Another good question. So, in my mind, once you get beyond the roof, the rest of the things are really site specific. So if you have a wood shake roof, that's one thing that you would want to change. And if you didn't do that, many other things you might do may not help at the end of the day. But I think that that one good reason for conducting careful post-fire investigations will be to enable us to do this kind of prioritization in terms of what's the most, in terms of bang for your buck. You do this, then you do that, and you'll be able to tick off how much you've reduced your vulnerability. But at this point, I think it's really hard to give a general statement in my mind beyond the roof. But I really think because of this Ember resistant component, these non-combustible zones are really important, and areas where embers can accumulate are really important. And then reducing the vulnerability of vents would be really important. So if you have 1/4-inch mesh screen, I would be changing that out. And to the extent possible, get yourself a non-combustible zone. If you have areas where you have that vertical space where you have siding going to the ground, I'd be working on those kind of areas.
Okay, thanks. So another question from Paul that's a hot topic in Canada, and I think probably also in the U.S. But do some of your member insurers at IBHS offer incentives for homeowners with the fire resilience measures incorporated into their homes and in properties?
So I know that one insurance company will give a discount to insureds if they live in a fire-wise community, and others will address it some way if they live in an area with other kinds of certifications that would be locally grown. These items regarding what insurance companies do, we don't really, we provide information to insurance companies and our members, and then they use it the best way they can. We don't really get involved in discount kind of discussions. I just observe what I see on the ground.
Okay, fair enough. Another question. So you mentioned a couple of issues related to the very near home area, both sort of, I guess, the vertical and horizontal components, including issues like mesh and so that 6-inch space, non-combustible space between the surface and siding and that sort of thing. And some of the discussion that's been going around in Canada after some recent fires are vulnerability posed to buildings by very simple, seemingly simple things like doormats and wicker furniture on verandas and that sort of thing. Are you aware? So I guess, do you have any more information on that topic? What are the recommendations, and are you aware of any jurisdictions that are trying to enforce requirements related to this very near home area?
So I'll start with the latter first. I don't know of any organization that is enforcing this near home zone area. I know that the United States education organizations, FireWise, sort of nationwide, Living with Fire in Nevada, Lake Tahoe area, they and IBHS are on board with this zone, and so it's really part of the educational outreach effort. I think codes are it just takes longer for them to catch up with some things, and the education organization can just do it. So that's that one. So we have done some experiments with doormats and the like, and the koi type, the fiber type, we did find that they would ignite to an ember exposure, and even though they're right at the house, these are types of things that will collect and stop an ember, so they'll accumulate there. We only really had smoldering combustion in the test that we did, but if you had debris in amongst that mat, then I think you would readily have flaming. We actually incorporated a sort of a recycled rubber doormat in this short study, and the embers sort of flew off of that, so it did nothing. And we also used a recycled plastic doormat. And we had a lot of smoldering there, but no flaming on that one. And that sort of agrees with another test we did with artificial turf, which we had a lot of smoldering, no flaming. But with these kind of situations, it seems to me that debris will be accumulating on these items, both the doormat and astroturf. And so it'd be sort of a combination. And we really haven't looked at that yet, except to know that from work we've done with all kinds of bark, all kinds of mulch near a building, whether it be pine needle or bark mulch of any kind, and some other studies that I did back in the day with my colleague Ed Smith at University of Nevada, in terms of mulch. Flame spread occurs in mulch, and embers readily ignite all kinds of mulch, and so combustible materials in conjunction with things that might ordinarily only smolder, I think would result in flaming ultimately. So the best kind of doormat, if we sort of circle back around to that, actually the recycled plastic one, because it was a dense kind of material that seemed to work well. And you have metal doormats, and we've shown brooms leaning against a building are readily ignited by embers. All these kind of fine fuel items are readily ignited. And so if you have them, that is one thing you toss when wildfire threatens you, to bring them inside or get them well away from the house, because they just result in a flaming exposure to the side of the house.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Maybe a couple more questions and we'll sign off, because we're getting a little bit closer to 11:30. So one question is about the implementation of Chapter 7A of the California Building Code. So, at one time this was introduced as a new part of the code. What was involved in, engaging and educating the code officials, the inspectors and that sort of thing, and getting them up to speed about these requirements? And do you have a sense about how well these code requirements are being enforced?
So I know about the educational program. So the development of 7A started years before it actually became official, and it was implemented in two parts. It was completely implemented by 2008, but it started in sort of early 2000s, I think, in terms of meetings and whatnotting. The educational effort, I think the state fire marshal at the time, Chief Dargan, had obtained some funding to develop and provide educational courses all up and down the state. She hired me part-time to coordinate this, and then we had a cadre of teachers that were either fire officials or building officials. The team that taught the course typically was one fire person, one building code person, and myself, who talked about the standard test methods, since they were developed at the University of California where I was working at the time. And we gave 70 classes up and down the state. I enlisted my cooperative extension colleagues to host. We had a lot of interest from just various people. I think organizations that lumberyard type of organizations, they were interested in hosting. many people were interested in hosting, and we gave these classes. It was a 4-hour class telling the people in the room what 7A was going to do. And so we targeted the building code official, the fire official, because of the defensible space requirements tied to 7A, the fire official, which typically did vegetation management things, and the building code official, which typically did materials things. They needed to talk to make sure that everything was good and to decide who was going to do what in this code. But we were also targeting people that would be affected by it. So we tried to get designers and architects and contractors, and then people that sold materials, so lumber yards and hardware stores, and people that made, so manufacturers. So we tried to hit the people that 7A would touch. And I think the thing that we didn't do, which would have been a good idea, and we thought about it towards the end, was getting to the planners also. But I think it was a pretty effective program, and I think some foresight by Chief Dargan to realize this was a necessary component. And in terms of how well it's being, I think it is definitely being implemented. The way that it's defined, California has state responsibility areas where the state has control. So that's more rural areas. That's definitely, I think it's implemented there. 7A is also applicable in the very high fire hazard severity zones in local responsibility areas. So cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco, big cities. Well, any incorporated part that has this very high rating as defined by a group within the state fire marshal's office. And I don't have information about that. And I think it's definitely being implemented, but whether it's being implemented everywhere, I don't really know.
Right. Okay. Thanks. Just one last question, or we're getting pretty close to the end of the session here, but maybe quickly, do you have a sense of if these code requirements are effective? Are these homes burning less frequently?
That's a good question. I don't know, but I think that this last series of fires in Northern California, there are a number of 7A homes and non-7A homes that have been damaged or destroyed. And I know that CAL FIRE has been sending out post-fire assessment teams for the last couple of years anyway. And the assessment follows 7A kind of issues. And so I think once that information is analyzed, I think we'll have a better understanding of the effectiveness of 7A. 7A also gets revised every few years and is undergoing a revision right now. So I think it's always intended to be on the improvement path. It's not a perfect thing, and I think people are interested in making it better.
Okay, great. Well, some work that we'll have to keep our eyes out for. Thanks again, Steve. Before we sign off, any last comments?
I just want to thank people for hanging in there, and send me an email if you have any questions. And I think if you're interested in some of these reports, please visit our site, disastersafety.org.
Okay, thanks again, and remember to all our attendees to check out the C4 conference that's coming up soon. Again, you can check the chat box for some information on that. And we'll sign off until next time. Thanks again, Dr. Quarles.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all.